Letters never sent. The first thing you notice when the chute opens is the sound, or the absence of it. The roar of the C-47's engines is replaced by a hush so vast it feels like the world is holding its breath. Just the wind tugging at the lines, the faint whistle of fabric trembling overhead. For a moment, I felt weightless, hanging in the dark above a foreign countryside I'd only seen in intelligence briefings. Normandy, June 6th. D-Day. I never told you, but I was terrified. More than the usual jitters we'd learned to mask back in training. My hand brushed the cold steel of my Thompson slung across my chest, searching for something solid real. Below, the fields were stitched with narrow hedgerows, and the flares, damn those flares, kept bursting, blinding bursts of white that turned night into a frozen photograph. Shadows of other chutes flickered like ghosts. Some too close, others too far. The plan had been simple: drop over the designated zone, rally at the church steeple, St. Mire-Église, and advance together. But the flak had scattered us. The sky was chaos, tracers cutting fiery arcs, anti-aircraft bursts blooming too close. I saw one plane, a C-47, take a direct hit mid-belly. A split second where the light bloomed brighter than day, and then it was gone, just raining embers. I landed wrong. Came down hard in a marsh, legs buckling, half submerged in stinking water. The harness twisted, choking me until I could unclip. No sign of the others. Only the distant staccato of gunfire, too close for comfort. I remember whispering names, Jenkins, Diaz, Croft, like maybe saying them out loud would conjure them from the dark. But there was no answer. Only the distant thunder of the invasion force pressing on shore. The smell hit me first, the raw, muddy stink of the marsh mixed with the sharp tang of cordite drifting from the coastline. My boots sank deep into the muck as I fought free of the harness, my fingers fumbling with the buckles, every tiny metallic click sounding far too loud. The parachute, pale and limp, floated on the surface behind me, a dead thing tethered to my back. I cut the cords and let it sink, swallowing the evidence of my landing into the murk. A flare went up somewhere to the west, painting the landscape in cruel whites and grays. I crouched instinctively, clutching my Thompson tighter, eyes scanning for movement. Nothing but the hedgerows, twisted and foreign, like walls closing in. We'd been briefed about these fields, how the bocage would make every advance slow and bloody. But words on a map didn't prepare you for the way it felt, trapped in that tangled mess of earth and thorn. My orders were simple: link up with the others, secure the causeways, hold the ground for the seaborne troops pushing inland. But there was no sign of the others. No rally point in sight. Just the distant crackle of rifle fire, the occasional burst of machine gun, a stuttering cough that cut the night like a bone saw. I whispered their names again. Jenkins, Diaz, Croft. My voice sounded small, weak, and the guilt, hell, it was already gnawing at me. I've been too slow on the jump. Hesitated a fraction too long before leaping into the void. The others had gone ahead, and now I was stranded God knows where. A shape moved in the fog ahead. Fast, low. I dropped to my stomach, pressing into the mud as the figure emerged. A paratrooper, just like me. His face pale beneath the grime, uniform dark and soaked. He didn't see me at first, just stumbled forward, clutching his side. Then he froze, eyes going wide as he spotted my helmet peeking over the reeds. I raised my hand, open palm, the signal for friendly, and he sagged with relief, sinking to his knees. It was Wilcox, one of the new guys, barely 19. Lieutenant. Thank Christ, he gasped, voice hoarse. Blood smeared his sleeve. Wilcox, you hit? I whispered, scanning the hedgerow behind him. He shook his head, trembling. No, not mine. Sergeant Keller. I couldn't help him. His voice cracked. They were waiting, right on the drop zone. I felt the anger rising, sharp and bitter. This was supposed to be a surprise landing. They weren't supposed to be waiting. Where? I demanded. Wilcox pointed southeast, past the next hedgerow. Machine gun nest. I think Diaz went that way. But a shot rang out close. Too close. Wilcox flinched, clutching at my arm like a drowning man. There was no time for questions. I pulled him to his feet, forcing calm into my voice. We stick together. Keep low. We find Diaz. Move. The fog pressed tighter around us as we crept forward, the damp earth swallowing our footsteps. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, to get out of this death trap, but the fear, the guilt, it rooted me in place. I wasn't leaving anyone behind. Not again. We reached the hedgerow, and that's when I heard it, labored breathing, just on the other side. I raised my hand, motioning Wilcox to cover me as I peeked through a gap in the brush. Diaz. He was slumped against the roots of an ancient tree, his uniform torn, a dark stain spreading across his chest. But he was alive, his eyes fluttering open as I whispered his name. Hold on, buddy. We've got you. But before I could move, the ground erupted. Tracers sliced the air, a brutal chatter of automatic fire from somewhere deeper in the fog. Wilcox cried out, dropping low as rounds tore through the leaves overhead. They knew we were here, and now we were trapped. The gunfire tore through the hedgerow, shredding leaves and splintering wood inches from my head. I hit the dirt hard, chest heaving, the smell of damp earth filling my nose. Wilcox was somewhere to my right, face down in the mud, clutching his helmet with both hands like it could keep the bullets out. Diaz was still propped against the tree, half conscious, the blood on his uniform spreading faster now. I had to think. Fast. The machine gun was close. Maybe 50 yards, judging by the sound. German MG-42. By the speed of the bursts, so fast it blurred into a mechanical growl. Suppression fire. They weren't aiming to kill. Not yet. They were keeping us pinned. A voice called out then, sharp, girl, German. Barked orders, a harsh echo in the fog. My mind raced back to the briefings. A listening post, maybe. Or a forward scout position. Either way, they knew we dropped. And they were staying put to finish the job. I scanned the brush, heart hammering so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. The light was bad, shifting shadows. Pale burst from the flares overhead, but there, just past the tree line. A low mound of earth, sandbags. Firing slit. Wilcox. I hissed, low but firm. He flinched but looked my way, eyes wide. I'm gonna draw fire, I whispered, my voice steady though my pulse was anything but. You circle left. Flank them. Count to 10, then go. He just stared. Wilcox, you hear me? A shaky nod. Why, yeah. Good man. I shifted, pressing deeper into the mud. My hands were trembling as I unlatched a grenade from my harness, the metal cold, solid. Count to 3. 1, 2. I lobbed it high, the pin clinking against the casing. The explosion lit the fog in a bloom of dirty orange. I was moving before the echoes died up, firing blind into the hedge, burst from my Thompson, kicking mud and leaves into the air. Return fire shredded the air just behind me. Close. Too damn close. Wilcox broke left, his shadow vanishing into the mist. I saw the muzzle flashes now, 2 positions. Maybe more. The MG stuttered, shifted, sweeping toward him. No, I couldn't let him. I heard it before I saw it, a low, ragged cry, the sound of someone hit. Wilcox, hold your fire. I bellowed, desperate, my voice raw. I surrender. The words tasted like ash, but they had the effect I needed. The gunfire ceased, sudden and absolute. The fog closed in, thick, suffocating. I felt the cold barrel of a rifle press against my neck a heartbeat later. A voice growled in German, close enough that I could hear the man's breath. I didn't understand all of it, but the meaning was clear. Don't move. Diaz was still bleeding out behind me. Wilcox, Christ, I didn't know if he was even alive. And I was on my knees in the mud, hands raised, the guilt heavier than the sky pressing down on my shoulders. I had failed them. Again. The German soldier loomed above me, rifle steady, his breath visible in the damp chill of the Norman night. My hands shook, palms coated in mud as I kept them raised, the damp seeping deeper into my knees. The fog wrapped around us, muffling the sounds of distant gunfire, the tide of the invasion rumbling like a storm far off. I stole a glance toward Diaz, his chest barely moving now, pale as the smoke drifting overhead, but I didn't dare shift my weight. The German's eyes, pale and young, locked on mine with a blend of fear and calculation, like he was deciding if I was worth the bullet. Time slowed. I could hear the damp click as he shifted his boot in the mud, felt the cold press of my dog tags against my neck, the ache in my legs from kneeling too long. Somewhere behind him, another figure moved, taller, broader, an officer by the cut of his uniform and the way he held his sidearm. He spoke quickly in German, sharp commands I only half understood, but the tone was unmistakable. Finish him. My heart hammered against my ribs as the younger soldier swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the trigger, the barrel trembling now like he was trying to convince himself this was just another task. The gunshot never came. A crack echoed, sharp and sudden from the mist beyond the hedgerow, and the boy staggered backward with a wet gasp, his rifle dropping into the mud with a lifeless clatter. Blood bloomed dark on his chest, and he crumpled, twitching once before going still. I didn't think. My hand was already closing around my Thompson, mud-streaked but steady as I wheeled toward the officer. He fired first, a wild shot that went wide, the muzzle flash blinding, but I fired next. The recoil hit hard, a violent burst tearing through the damp air. He dropped before his body even registered what had happened, legs folding awkwardly as he hit the dirt. Silence, deafening in its weight. I stayed crouched, waiting, breath ragged, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the earth until I was sure there were no others. My eyes flicked back toward Diaz. He hadn't moved, his skin pallid and soaked through. Wilcox. I had almost forgotten. Wilcox had gone left, right into the line of fire, and the sound he made haunted me more than the gunshots. Crawling low, I found him slumped just beyond the hedge, a deep gash across his thigh where a round had torn through. He wasn't dead, but close, his face twisted with pain, teeth clenched so tight they looked ready to crack. Stay with me, Wilcox. You hear me? My voice felt foreign, trembling, too loud in the stillness. I tore a bandage from my kit, pressing it hard against the wound, the blood soaking through faster than I could stop it. He nodded weakly, eyes fluttering, but his grip on my wrist was strong, desperate. I kept pressure, cursing the damp, the mud, the damned hedgerows that swallowed us whole. We couldn't stay here. Not with the bodies cooling behind me, not with a lingering threat that more would come. I knew the Germans. They'd noticed the missing patrol. They'd come looking. If we were still here when they arrived, it wouldn't be a fight, it would be an execution. I hauled Wilcox upright, his weight sagging hard against me as he groaned, teeth gritted against the pain. He was heavier than he looked, his uniform waterlogged, but I didn't let go. Step by step, I dragged him back toward Diaz, where he still lay motionless under the tree. Every inch of my body screamed to run, to leave them and save myself, but that wasn't who I was. Not anymore. Diaz stirred as I reached him, a faint whisper slipping from his lips, too weak to form words. I could see the wound clearly now, mid-torso, just below the ribs. Bad. The kind of bad that made me wonder if moving him would finish what the bullet had started. But staying wasn't an option. Not with the sound of boots, distant but closing, echoing somewhere deeper in the fog. Hold on, guys. Just hold on. I looped Diaz's arm over my shoulder, his head lolling against my neck, his breath hot but faint. Wilcox gritted his teeth as he pushed off the mud with his good leg, leaning hard into me on the other side. We were a mess, 3 half-dead paratroopers limping through the mud, hearts hammering in sync with the distant gunfire echoing closer. And still, the guilt clawed deeper, gnawing at my ribs. Because I knew the truth, the only reason we were out here, bleeding in the dark, was me. I'd hesitated on the jump. I'd gotten us scattered, broken, lost. And it wasn't over. Not yet. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in like a living thing, swallowing the edges of the hedgerows until the world narrowed to the sound of our labored breaths and the wet squelch of mud beneath our boots. Diaz sagged heavier with every step, his body limp, head lolling awkwardly against my shoulder. Wilcox clung tighter to me, his face twisted in pain, lips moving as though whispering prayers too quiet for me to catch. I could feel the tremble in his body, the exhaustion mixing with shock, but there was no stopping. Not with the echo of boots behind us, closer now. Pacing, stalking. I forced my mind to stay sharp, scanning the dark for cover. The bocage, endless rows of thick, ancient hedgerows, offered no escape, just more blind corridors, more places for them to surround us. Somewhere out there was the causeway, the rally point we were supposed to hold, but I was turned around, disoriented. Landmarks blurred together in the fog, and I could hear my heartbeat louder than the distant rifle fire. We reached a low ditch, the earth damp and overgrown, half swallowed by thorn vines. I eased Diaz down first, his body crumpling with a ragged groan that made my stomach twist. Wilcox collapsed beside him, his face pale as chalk, the blood loss draining what little strength he had left. I knelt, pressing my hand against Diaz's wound, feeling the warmth spill through my fingers even as I tried to pack it tighter with a wadded dressing from my field kit. His eyelids fluttered, his breath a thin rasp, and he whispered something then, just a word. "Ma madre." It hit me like a punch to the chest. I'd seen that look before, the glassy, far-off stare soldiers got when they were halfway here, halfway somewhere else. I gritted my teeth, voice low but firm as I leaned closer. "Hey, stay with me. Diaz, look at me. You're not done, you hear?" "Not yet." But his eyes were losing focus, the pain fading into something deeper, heavier. Wilcox stirred, his head rolling weakly toward me. We're not going to make it, are we?" "Shut up." The words came harder than I intended, a bark of raw fear disguised as command. "I'm getting you both out. You just hold on." The boots. Closer. Slow, steady, deliberate. They were hunting us now, moving with the patience of wolves closing in on wounded prey. I gripped my Thompson tighter, the mud-caked steel pressing firm against my chest, but I knew the truth. If they came over that ridge, saw us like this, exposed, broken, there'd be no fight. Just execution. And then the flare went up. Blinding white. It burst overhead with a crack, light flooding the fog and painting the world in stark frozen shadows. For a heartbeat, everything seemed suspended. I saw them then, 3 figures cresting the ridge, silhouetted by the flare's burn. German soldiers, helmets glinting, rifles raised. One shouted, pointing toward our ditch, the words lost under the ringing in my ears. I didn't think. Didn't breathe. Just moved. The Thompson bucked hard against my shoulder as I fired short, controlled bursts that punched into the night, shredding the stillness. The lead figure crumpled, a burst catching him square in the chest, his rifle tumbling free. The others dropped low, returning fire with sharp cracks of Mauser rounds that whined past too close, kicking dirt into my face. "Stay down." I shouted back at Wilcox and Diaz, pressing lower into the mud, the Thompson's magazine almost empty now, each shot a desperate gamble. The second soldier went down, his leg, maybe judging by the way he fell, but the third was still out there, circling wide. Smart bastard. A burst of pain seared my shoulder, hot and sudden, knocking me sideways into the ditch. The impact stole my breath, my hands spasming around the Thompson's grip as I hit the mud. Not deep. A graze, I realized, blinking hard, forcing myself back upright. But it was enough. The third one was close now. I could hear his breath, ragged, his boots crunching just beyond the fog. My mind raced, searching for options, but there was nothing left. No time, no cover. Just the sharp metallic click of a bolt being drawn back, the sound impossibly loud. And then, a single, deafening crack split the air. Not from my weapon. Not German, either. The soldier jerked sideways, his body crumpling into the dirt, rifle falling slack from his hands. Behind him, through the thinning fog, a shape emerged, tall, lean, rifle still raised. Croft. He looked different. Mud-caked, face streaked with blood, someone else's, I guessed, but it was him. The same Croft who'd been in my stick since Sicily. He lowered the rifle slowly, gaze sweeping the carnage before landing on me, breathless in the mud with Wilcox and Diaz bleeding out beside me. "Lieutenant," he said, voice hoarse, "you look like hell." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I gritted my teeth, pressing harder against Diaz's wound, the blood still soaking through my hands. "Help me. We're not leaving them here." And Croft? He didn't argue. Not even once. Croft knelt beside me without a word, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the chaos around us. His rifle slung across his back, his hands worked quickly, tearing into his own pack for supplies. He didn't need to ask what needed doing. There was a quiet understanding between us, forged in the brutal simplicity of war. His fingers moved deftly over Diaz's wound, pressing a clean bandage down as I continued to hold it together. His eyes flicked up to meet mine briefly. They were as worn and bloodshot as mine, but there was something else behind them. Determination, maybe, or a quiet resignation to the grim reality of our situation. The gunfire had stopped, but that didn't mean we were safe. The Germans were still out there, possibly regrouping. Croft didn't waste time with pleasantries or false reassurances. His voice was low but firm as he assessed the situation, checking Wilcox's leg, then shifting his attention back to me. "We don't have long," he said, his words cutting through the cold night air. "We can't stay here. If they send a larger patrol, we're dead in the water." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The pain in my shoulder was starting to throb, a dull reminder of how lucky I was that the wound hadn't been worse. But that didn't matter now. I couldn't afford to be distracted by my own injuries. We had to move, and we had to move fast. I glanced down at Wilcox, still semi-conscious, his eyes flickering with confusion, but sharp enough to catch my gaze. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but his words came out in a soft rasp. "Don't talk," I said quickly, squeezing his shoulder gently, though it felt like I was the one who needed reassurance. "You're gonna be fine. Just hang on." Croft didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Wilcox was barely hanging on, and Diaz was a different story. I could see the faint flicker of life still clinging to him, but it was fading fast. "I'm going to carry him," Croft said, more in order than a suggestion. His voice was firm, but I saw the strain in his jaw. He didn't need to say it out loud, but the truth was clear. If we didn't get out of here soon, we'd all be dead. "I'll help you," I offered, but he shook his head before I could make a move. "No, you're already carrying Wilcox. I'll take Diaz." We stick together, slow and steady. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Wall had our roles, and mine was to get Wilcox out of here, no matter the cost. I helped Croft ease Diaz into his arms, wincing as the man's body sagged in his grip. The blood loss had left him light as a rag doll, but it didn't make carrying him any easier. Croft's muscles flexed as he adjusted his position, shifting Diaz so he could carry him more securely. "Let's move," Croft said again, his voice clipped, as though there was no room for hesitation. We all knew there was none. We started moving again, dragging ourselves through the thick, sticky mud. The air was cold, the mist still clinging to everything, muffling any sounds beyond the dull rhythm of our steps. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the brush had us flinching. We were alive, but that could change in an instant. We were heading toward the rally point, the place where we were supposed to regroup with the others, if there were any others left. The whole drop had been chaos, our units scattered, and the drop zone was nothing like the map had promised. The only thing we could count on now was each other. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder, watching for signs of movement, but it was the quiet kind of silence, empty and waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was the kind of instinct you get when you've been in enough fire to know that silence isn't always the absence of danger. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. Croft was ahead now, leading us, and I could hear him breathing in the cold air, his steps crunching softly in the underbrush. Wilcox's weight was beginning to drag me down, but I forced myself to keep moving. We couldn't afford to stop, not until we had cover, not until we were out of the line of sight. We reached the edge of a small clearing, a patch of trees where we could rest. Croft paused just ahead of me, his hand motioning for silence as he surveyed the area. "Stay here," he whispered, glancing back at me. "I'll check ahead." Before I could protest, he disappeared into the trees. The movement felt familiar, instinctive. He'd done this 100 times before, the silent recon. I could hear him moving through the brush, and then the sudden stillness settled around me again, thick and suffocating. I tried to settle Wilcox against a tree, easing him down as carefully as I could. His eyes were half-lidded, and I could tell he wasn't fully aware of what was going on anymore. But I didn't have time to think about that. I had to keep moving. As I checked Diaz again, his breath ragged and shallow, I heard the crack of a twig. My heart leapt into my throat, and I instinctively reached for my rifle, but it was only Croft, slipping back through the trees. "It's clear," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. "For now. But we need to keep moving." I nodded, pulling Wilcox up as carefully as I could. We couldn't afford to stop, not with everything so close to falling apart. The night was still young, but it felt like we'd already lived a lifetime. We moved again, not knowing whether we were walking toward salvation or toward a trap. But there was no other choice. Not anymore. We kept moving through the trees, the night pressing in like a weight on our shoulders. The air smelled like wet earth and fear, and the sound of our footsteps was the only thing keeping us grounded. Wilcox's condition was worsening by the minute. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and the way his body was starting to sag, I knew we were running out of time. Diaz, too. He hadn't stirred since Croft had taken him in his arms, his face as pale as the mist swirling around us. Croft moved ahead again, slipping through the shadows like a ghost, and I followed, dragging Wilcox along as best I could. The further we went, the more it felt like we were walking in circles. The fog thickened again, turning the world into a blur of gray and black, and it wasn't long before I began to doubt if we were even heading in the right direction. But there was nothing else to do. We couldn't stop. If we stopped, we'd die. Suddenly, Croft stopped, holding up his hand, signaling us to stay low. He crouched low to the ground, his eyes scanning the area ahead. I caught my breath, my fingers tightening around my rifle, and for a moment, it felt like everything around us had gone completely still. Then the unmistakable sound of boots, heavy, methodical, echoed through the fog. German voices, too, soft but deliberate, moving toward us. They were close. Too close. I ducked down beside Wilcox, forcing him to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. The seconds dragged on like hours. I could hear them, could feel the distance closing between us, and all I could think was that we had to make it out of here. "Don't make a sound," Croft whispered, his voice low and urgent, but even he knew the odds were slim. The German patrol was just on the other side of a small rise, hidden by the trees, but so close I could hear the rustling of their equipment, the swish of their jackets brushing against the branches. My mind raced. We were pinned down. Diaz was fading fast, and Wilcox's condition, well, it wasn't any better. We had no cover, no reinforcements, no way to fight our way out of this. The odds weren't just stacked against us. They were insurmountable. I looked at Croft. His jaw was clenched, eyes scanning the terrain like a hawk. He didn't have a plan. None of us did. There was no way out. Then, out of the silence, came a noise that wasn't supposed to be there. A footstep. Just one, but it echoed loud enough in my mind to make me freeze, to make the blood in my veins run cold. I turned to look at Croft, and his eyes met mine with that same resigned understanding. We were screwed. But just as quickly, Croft shifted his weight, moving fast as a shadow, his rifle raised. A single shot rang out, sharp and sudden, and the German soldier on the rise dropped, a perfect hit to the chest. The others reacted instantly, voices shouting, scrambling. But it was too late. Croft was already on the move, charging forward through the fog, his rifle firing in rapid succession, hitting his targets with brutal precision. There was no hesitation in him, no second thoughts, just the cold, calculated movement of a man who had been trained to survive. I didn't wait. I couldn't. With one final push, I dragged Wilcox to his feet, hoisting him up as best I could, stumbling in the direction Croft had gone. There was no room for fear now. Only the overwhelming, singular drive to survive. The shots from Croft's rifle were still ringing in my ears, the sound of chaos and carnage filling the air as I moved. The adrenaline surged through me, sharp and insistent, and somehow, through the confusion and the fog, we made it. Made it to the edge of the clearing, made it to the trees where Croft had vanished. Then ahead there, through the haze, was the rally point. It was barely visible, but I could make it out. I knew we were close. Just a few more yards, and we could finally catch our breath. But when I reached the rally point, I found no soldiers waiting for us. No comrades. Just the empty remnants of a battlefield, scattered with discarded gear, and the eerie silence of a place that had once held promise. We were alone. I set Wilcox down carefully, trying to ignore the faint tremble in my hands. He was unconscious now, his body limp and cold. Diaz was no better. He had slipped away while we were on the move, his body growing colder with every passing minute. The reality of it hit me then, the weight of everything. The weight of what had been lost. There were no words to describe the emptiness that filled me. We were just three survivors in a war that had swallowed so many others whole. And in the end, there were no answers. No reasons. Just the endless, unrelenting forward march of history. I glanced over at Croft, who had returned, his face grim but unreadable. His eyes flicked to the empty rally point, then back to me. We shared a look. It was all we could do. We didn't need words anymore. We weren't the first to have survived this nightmare, and we wouldn't be the last. But in the end, it didn't matter how many battles we fought. The cost of survival had already been paid. And now it was just a matter of moving on, of trying to live with what was left. I heard the faint, distant hum of planes overhead. Our planes, maybe, but they didn't feel like salvation. They felt like the echoes of a world that had already moved on. And so we moved, one step after another, until there was no more.